The Kingston Harbour Tavern shakes with laughter in March 1715 as weathered pirates mock Samuel Bellamy's drawings of impossible sails and underwater blades that swing like doors beneath a ship's hull. These men sailed traditional sloops 60 feet long, single-masted, built for coastal raids but helpless against naval frigates in open water. Bellamy, barely 26 years old, had spent 3 years studying every vessel in the Caribbean, from Spanish galleons carrying Peruvian silver to Arawak fishing boats that danced across waves like water spiders. The revelation came during a hurricane off Hispaniola, when Bellamy watched native fishermen survive mountainous seas in tiny boats with triangular sails that could rotate completely around their masts. While British warships foundered with their fixed square rigging, these nimble craft rode the storm by changing their sail angle instantly. Bellamy's genius lay in combining this ancient wisdom with Dutch flyboat hull designs and adding his revolutionary retractable keel iron plates on hinges that could drop 20 feet down for stability or pull up flat against the hull for shallow water navigation. Working in secret with a freed slave named Diego who knew African dhow sailing techniques and a disgraced Royal Navy shipwright named Collins, Bellamy spent 8,000 pieces of 8, his entire fortune from 2 years of piracy converting a captured Jamaican sloop. The modifications seemed insane. The traditional square mainsail replaced with a triangular configuration that could swing 270 degrees, a weighted keel system operated by windlass that could change the ship's draft from 4 feet to 20 feet in minutes, and a redistributed ballast system that allowed the vessel to heel at angles that would capsize traditional ships. The first test nearly killed them all when the new rigging configuration caught wind wrong and almost tore the mast out. But after adjustments, the Marianne could sail 15 degrees closer to the wind than any naval vessel, turn in half the space, and achieve speeds of 12 knots when frigates struggled to make 8. More importantly, it could strike from windward positions thought impossible and escape into waters too shallow for pursuit. But here's what the records don't tell us. The official accounts describe Bellamy's innovations in dry technical language, yet something darker lurks beneath the surface of this story. Why would a young English pirate risk everything on designs that contradicted centuries of European naval wisdom? The tavern mockery that March evening was more than professional skepticism. It was the old world dismissing knowledge that had survived in the shadows of colonialism for generations. Diego's presence in this story raises questions that historians rarely examine. A freed slave who somehow possessed intimate knowledge of African dhow sailing techniques, who spoke multiple languages, who could read technical drawings. This was no ordinary man. The records mention him exactly 3 times across all surviving documents from this period, always as a footnote, never as a protagonist in his own right. What bargain did he strike with Bellamy? What did he gain from revolutionizing pirate warfare? And where did he vanish to after the Marianne's maiden voyage proved successful? Collins, the disgraced Royal Navy shipwright, presents an equally intriguing mystery. British naval records confirm his dismissal in 1712, for reasons that remain redacted even in recently declassified documents. 3 years later, he appears in Jamaica with advanced knowledge of hull design that wouldn't become standard Royal Navy practice for another 2 decades. Some historians suggest he was stealing experimental designs from Deptford shipyards. Others whisper about his time in the Mediterranean, where he allegedly studied with shipbuilders whose techniques traced back to Phoenician methods. The hurricane off Hispaniola that inspired Bellamy's revelation occurred on August 14, 1713. This much we can verify through Spanish colonial weather records and damage reports from Santo Domingo, but Bellamy's journal entries from this period, preserved in fragments at the Mariners' Museum, contain peculiar gaps. 5 consecutive days are missing, torn from the binding with unusual care, as if someone wanted to remove specific information while leaving the surrounding context intact. What happened during those 5 days that warranted such deliberate erasure? The native fishermen who survived the storm using triangular sails were almost certainly Taíno or Kalinago peoples, descendants of cultures that Spanish colonization had nearly destroyed by 1713. Their nautical knowledge represented thousands of years of Caribbean sailing wisdom, yet European records treated them as curiosities rather than master mariners. Bellamy clearly recognized their expertise. But how did a young English pirate gain their trust sufficiently to learn secrets that they'd hidden from Spanish conquistadors for 2 centuries? The cost of the conversion, 8,000 pieces of 8, represents an astronomical sum for 1715. To put this in perspective, a skilled carpenter earned perhaps 200 pieces of 8 per year. Bellamy supposedly accumulated this fortune through just 2 years of piracy. Yet maritime insurance records from this period show no major losses attributed to vessels matching Bellamy's early career descriptions. Either he was operating under different names, or his early wealth came from sources the historical record conveniently omits. The windlass mechanism for the retractable keel presents its own technical mystery. Modern naval architects examining Bellamy's crude sketches preserved in the privateer Benjamin Hornigold's papers calculate that the mechanical advantage required to raise and lower nearly 2 tons of iron in under 15 minutes would have demanded engineering sophistication beyond what should have been available to pirates working in a makeshift Caribbean shipyard. Some researchers suggest the mechanism incorporated water displacement principles not formalized in Western engineering until the 1800s. The ballast redistribution system that allowed extreme heeling angles without capsizing defied contemporary understanding of stability. Traditional naval wisdom held that any vessel heeling beyond 45 degrees risked turtling, yet witnesses consistently reported Bellamy's modified vessels operating effectively at 60-degree heel angles during combat maneuvers. The physics work on paper, but require precise mathematical calculations of center of gravity and buoyancy that shouldn't have been possible without accurate instruments for measuring displacement instruments that weren't available to pirate shipwrights in 1715. And then there's the question no historian adequately addresses. Why didn't the innovation spread faster? Bellamy succeeded in March 1715, yet records show only sporadic adoption of his techniques until after his death in 1717. If these modifications truly offered such overwhelming tactical advantages, why did it take 2 years for the pirate community to embrace them? What resistance existed beyond simple conservative thinking? Were there hidden costs or dangers that the triumphant narrative conveniently forgets? The Marianne's maiden voyage remains documented only through second-hand accounts, as Bellamy himself left no detailed record of that first successful raid. The target was supposedly a Spanish merchantman carrying sugar and indigo, captured off the coast of Cuba without a shot fired, but Spanish colonial records from 1715 show no such loss. The ship simply vanished from historical accounting, as if it never existed, or as if someone very deliberately erased it from official memory. What secrets did that first capture reveal? What knowledge did Bellamy gain that convinced him to freely share his innovations rather than guard them jealously as most pirates would? And why do the shadows grow longer the closer we look at the moments when history pivoted on the decisions of a 26-year-old pirate who dared to imagine that the wind might obey different masters? The answers, like so much about Samuel Bellamy, remain submerged in deeper waters than any retractable keel could sound. News of Bellamy's impossible captures spread through the pirate Republic of Nassau like fire through dry palm fronds. Edward Teach, not yet known as Blackbeard, arrived at Bellamy's camp with 40 men and 20,000 pieces of 8, demanding to purchase the secret. Charles Vane threatened to torture it out of captured crew members. But Bellamy, now calling himself the Robin Hood of the seas, freely shared his designs with any pirate who would sign articles promising quarter to captured crews and freedom to enslaved Africans. By September 1716, 23 pirate vessels operated with Bellamy's modifications, each adding their own innovations. Anne Bonny convinced Calico Jack Rackham to add a second triangular sail for redundancy. Olivier Levasseur, the French pirate called the Buzzard, created a version with twin retractable keels for even greater stability. Black Caesar, an escaped slave-turned-pirate chief, developed hand signals, allowing crews to coordinate sail changes in complete silence during night raids. The economic impact was catastrophic for colonial powers. Insurance rates from London to Kingston jumped from 2% to 12% of cargo value. The Spanish treasure fleet of 1717 delayed sailing for 4 months, costing the Crown 800,000 pieces of 8 in lost revenue. British merchants in Port Royal petitioned the governor, claiming losses of £3 million in 18 months. Sugar shipments from Barbados dropped 40% as planters refused to risk their harvest to the new devil ships that appeared from nowhere and vanished into reef-filled shallows. The human transformation was equally dramatic. Ships needing only 30 men instead of 80 meant larger shares of plunder and more democratic decision-making. Former slaves like Diego became sailing masters, valued for their knowledge above European navigation traditions. Native Caribbean pilots earned fortunes guiding pirate sloops through passages unknown to colonial charts. Women found opportunities as the lighter rigging required skill rather than brute strength. Mary Read commanded her own modified sloop by 1717, taking 3 merchant prizes in a single month. But here's what the records don't tell us. The meeting between Bellamy and Edward Teach supposedly occurred in June 1716 at a Nassau Beach tavern. Contemporary accounts describe it as a simple business negotiation. Yet Teach arrived with 20,000 pieces of 8, a fortune that represents more wealth than he could have possibly accumulated in his brief pirating career to that point. Where did this money come from? Some historians suggest backers in the American colonies, merchants who saw profit in destabilizing Spanish trade. Others whisper about darker sources, about Teach's mysterious voyage to West Africa in 1715 that appears in no official logs but surfaces repeatedly in slave trader correspondence. Charles Vane's threats of torture went beyond typical pirate posturing. Maritime court records from 1718 mention a sailor named Thomas Williams, who testified about unspeakable acts committed by Vane's crew to extract sailing secrets. Williams claimed 3 captured men died under interrogation, before Vane learned that Bellamy had already made the designs public. The testimony was struck from the record during trial, and Williams himself disappeared from historical accounting the following week. What exactly did Vane's men do during those interrogations? And what happened to Williams after he spoke too freely about pirate methods that powerful people preferred remain hidden? Bellamy's demand that pirates sign articles promising quarter and freedom sits strangely with historical context. Pirates traditionally operated under codes that guaranteed shares of plunder, but humanitarian concerns were notably absent. Why would Bellamy, a man who'd spent years robbing ships at gunpoint, suddenly develop such principled morality? His personal letters, 3 survive in the Massachusetts Historical Society, contain references to debts that must be paid and promises made to those who taught me. To whom did Bellamy owe such debts? What promises bound him to free enslaved people when profit would dictate selling them? The spread of modifications to 23 vessels in just 3 months represents a logistical impossibility that historians casually dismiss. Each conversion required specialized knowledge, weeks of skilled labor, tons of iron for the keel mechanisms, and redesigned sail configurations. Nassau in 1716 had perhaps 2 functional shipyards. Even working day and night, they couldn't have produced 23 modified vessels in 3 months. So, where were these ships actually converted? Some researchers point to hidden anchorages throughout the Bahamas, suggesting a network of secret shipyards that left no archaeological trace. Others propose that the modifications were simpler than described, that the legends grew beyond reality. But witness accounts from naval officers consistently describe capabilities that match Bellamy's original designs precisely. Anne Bonny's involvement raises particularly intriguing questions. She wouldn't officially begin her pirating career until 1720, yet here she appears in 1716, already influential enough to convince Calico Jack Rackham to adopt major ship modifications. Either the traditional timeline of her life is completely wrong, or Anne Bonny was an identity used by multiple women during this period. Pirate articles from Rackham's crew, preserved in Jamaican colonial archives, mention a Red Anne who served as quartermaster in 1716, 3 years before Bonny supposedly went to sea. The handwriting matches known Bonny letters. Was she operating under different names earlier in her career? And why would she need to hide her identity if pirate crews already accepted women? The hand signals developed by Black Caesar introduce an element that seems almost supernatural in historical accounts. Witnesses described pirates changing sail configurations in perfect unison on moonless nights, without spoken commands, creating an eerie silence during attacks that terrified merchant crews. How did Black Caesar develop such sophisticated non-verbal communication? African military traditions certainly included silent signaling, but adapting these to complex sailing maneuvers required intimate understanding of both systems. Caesar's background before enslavement remains completely unknown. No slave ship manifests list his origin. No plantation records document his servitude. He simply appears in historical records in 1714 as an established pirate captain, already commanding respect and following. The economic statistics tell their own mysterious story. Insurance rates jumped from 2% to 12%. This much is verified through Lloyd's of London archives. But the £3 million in losses claimed by Port Royal merchants vastly exceeds the documented value of ships captured during this period. Even accounting for exaggeration, the numbers don't reconcile. Were pirates capturing far more vessels than records show? Were merchants inflating losses for insurance fraud? Or was something else happening to Caribbean shipping that colonial authorities preferred not to document? The Spanish treasure fleet delay cost 800,000 pieces of 8 in lost revenue, according to a letter from the Casa de Contratación, dated November 17. Yet the same archives show the fleet actually sailed on schedule and arrived safely in Seville. Why would Spanish officials claim a delay that didn't occur? Some historians suggest internal political maneuvering, blaming pirates for economic problems caused by administrative corruption. Others point to a pattern in Spanish colonial correspondence from this period. Repeated references to shipping disruptions that maritime records don't support, as if two parallel realities existed in the paperwork. Mary Read commanding her own vessel by 1717 contradicts every biographical source about her life, which places her pirate career beginning in 1718. Yet Admiralty court documents from Port Royal explicitly name a Captain Mary Read captured in prize goods in March 1717, then released due to insufficient evidence. The dates don't match the accepted narrative. Either multiple women used the same distinctive name, or the traditional story of Mary Read's life is fundamentally wrong. The transformation of former slaves into respected sailing masters happened rapidly, too rapidly for natural adoption of new social norms. What leverage did these men possess that forced their acceptance? Knowledge alone rarely grants power in societies built on racial hierarchy. Yet, within months, Caribbean pirate crews were taking navigation orders from African pilots, treating them as equals. Some historians attribute this to pirate pragmatism, take expertise wherever you find it. But contemporary letters from colonial governors express bewilderment at the speed of this transformation, using language that suggests something more than practical necessity was at work. The 40% drop in Barbados sugar shipments is verified through customs records, but the reason remains debated. Planters claimed fear of pirate attacks. Economic historians note that 1716 saw unusually poor harvests due to drought. Yet neither explanation fully accounts for plantations that simply stopped exporting entirely, choosing to let sugar rot in warehouses rather than ship it. What were they really afraid of? And why do several plantation owners' personal journals from this period contain identical phrases about cargo better lost than delivered to those who would use it wrongly? The revolution in Caribbean piracy happened too fast, changed too much, and left too many contradictions in its wake. Every answer the historical record provides raises three new questions. Every documented fact sits beside a shadow that suggests deeper truths deliberately obscured. And in those shadows, something moves. The period from late 1717 to early 1718 marked the absolute peak of what historians call the golden age of piracy, though the men living it simply called it the sweet trade. Nassau transformed from a scattered collection of beach camps into a functioning pirate city of 5,000 souls, with 6 shipyards dedicated to Bellamy modifications working day and night. Benjamin Hornigold, the old pirate commodore, established an academy where experienced sailors taught the new techniques for a percentage of future plunder. The Great Charleston blockade of May 1718 demonstrated the innovation's strategic impact when Blackbeard's fleet of 4 modified sloops held the 4th largest city in British America hostage for a week. The shallow draft vessels navigated channels the Royal Navy couldn't follow, while their maneuverability allowed them to maintain a blockade with a quarter of the ships traditionally required. Governor Robert Johnson paid a ransom of medical supplies and £40,000 rather than see his city's trade destroyed. Spanish communications from this period reveal near panic among colonial administrators. The Viceroy of New Spain wrote to Madrid that these new pirate vessels appear like phantoms, strike like lightning, and vanish like morning mist. The Casa de Contratación, Spain's trade authority, calculated that modified pirate sloops captured more Spanish gold in 18 months than had been lost to piracy in the previous decade. Traditional convoy tactics failed because the pirates could sail circles around escort galleons, picking off stragglers at will. Yet success carried the seeds of destruction. Bellamy himself, flush with the largest pirate haul in history, 4.5 tons of gold and silver from the slave ship Whydah, decided to sail north to Cape Cod, where his lover Maria Hallett waited. On April 26, 1717, a nor'easter caught his fleet off Wellfleet. The very innovations that made the Whydah deadly in Caribbean waters, the high triangular sails and extended keel, became fatal weaknesses in North Atlantic storm seas. The ship capsized in minutes, taking Bellamy, 145 men, and the detailed plans for his next generation of modifications to the bottom. But here's what the records don't tell us. Nassau's transformation into a functioning city of 5,000 happened in roughly 18 months. Historical demographers studying population growth patterns find this expansion rate unprecedented for the period. Where did 5,000 people come from? Pirate crews numbered in the hundreds, not thousands. The rest must have been support personnel, merchants, shipwrights, prostitutes, tavern keepers, families. Yet no corresponding population drop appears in surrounding British colonies. No ship's manifests show mass migration to the Bahamas. These people simply materialized, as if Nassau became a magnet drawing those who existed in the margins of colonial record-keeping. Benjamin Hornigold Academy represents one of history's strangest educational institutions. A pirate teaching other pirates advanced sailing techniques for profit shouldn't work. Knowledge shared becomes knowledge devalued. Yet, accounts from 1717 describe waiting lists for Hornigold's courses, with students paying up to 500 pieces of 8 for 3 weeks of instruction. The curriculum, partially preserved in a sailor's notebook discovered in a Nassau attic in 1973, contains mathematical formulas that wouldn't appear in European naval textbooks for another 50 years. Vector calculations for sail angles, hydrodynamic principles for hull design, even a crude form of calculus applied to wind resistance. Where did Hornigold acquire this knowledge? He was a capable sailor, but no scholar. His will, filed in 1719 after accepting the king's pardon, mentions materials and papers bequeathed to me by my teacher, whose name I am sworn never to reveal. The Charleston blockade should have been militarily impossible. 4 sloops blockading a major port requires controlling dozens of channels and inlets across miles of coastline. Naval historians calculate that maintaining such a blockade effectively would require at least 16 vessels working in coordinated shifts. Yet Governor Johnson's official report, preserved in South Carolina colonial archives, confirms that only 4 pirate ships were involved, somehow monitoring all sea approaches simultaneously. Some researchers suggest an extensive lookout network on shore. Others point to references in merchant letters about the pirates' ability to see in darkness and knowing our sailing plans before we made them. Were there spies within Charleston itself, feeding Blackbeard information? And if so, who were they? What motivated colonial citizens to betray their own community to pirates? The ransom of medical supplies raises its own questions. £40,000 in 1718 could have purchased nearly any commodity on earth. Why specifically demand medical supplies? Blackbeard's fleet contained perhaps 200 men total. What medical emergency required such vast quantities of medicine? Some historians suggest he was stockpiling for Nassau, but Nassau by 1718 had regular trading contact with smugglers who could provide medicine. The answer might lie in a cryptic letter from a Charleston physician named Marcus Aurelius Hale to his brother in London. They took medicines for afflictions no Christian doctor has seen since the writings of Galen. I fear their destination lies beyond civilized shores. What disease was Blackbeach attempting to treat? And where was this destination beyond civilized shores? The Viceroy of New Spain's letter about phantom ships contains phrases that seem almost supernatural when read in full. The portion usually quoted by historians represents perhaps 1/4 of the actual text. The complete letter, archived in Seville and only partially translated, describes pirate vessels that appeared from within squalls that should not have been there, and moved against winds that should have held them fast. Spanish sailors reported sighting the same ships in locations, hundreds of miles apart within impossible timeframes. Either these reports represent mass hallucination, or something about the modified vessels allowed them to achieve speeds that shouldn't have been possible even with Bellamy's innovations. The Casa de Contratacion's calculation that pirates captured more gold in 18 months than the previous decade combines two separate mysteries. First, the Spanish archives from this period are unusually incomplete, entire ledgers missing, pages removed, documents that should exist but don't. The surviving records show enormous losses, but they feel curated, as if someone decided which thefts to document and which to hide. Second, the gold had to go somewhere. 5 years later, Spanish intelligence reports track unusual gold deposits, appearing in banks from Amsterdam to Constantinople. Gold with markings matching bars stolen by pirates, but deposited by accounts connected to European nobility and merchant houses. How did pirate gold make its way into legitimate banking systems so quickly? Who was laundering it? And what percentage did they take for their services? Bellamy's decision to sail to Cape Cod makes no tactical sense. He'd just captured the largest prize in pirate history. Standard practice would be to head to a friendly port to divide the plunder and celebrate. Instead, he immediately sailed north toward Maria Hallett, a woman he allegedly hadn't seen in 4 years, who'd borne him a child that died in infancy, who by all accounts had gone mad from grief and poverty. What drew him to Cape Cod with such urgency that he'd risk his crew and fortune on North Atlantic weather in spring storm season? The nor'easter that sank the Whydah appears in weather records as a minor coastal storm, certainly dangerous, but not the catastrophic tempest that should be required to sink a well-built vessel with an experienced crew. The Whydah had survived Caribbean hurricanes. Her modifications made her more stable than traditional vessels. Yet witnesses on shore reported she capsized in minutes, as if struck by a force beyond natural wind and wave. 2 survivors from the wreck gave testimony before Massachusetts courts. Their descriptions don't match each other or physical possibility. One claimed the ship fell into a hole in the ocean. The other described black lightning that rose from the water rather than falling from sky. Both men were judged delirious from their ordeal and their testimony dismissed. The claim that Bellamy carried plans for next-generation modifications appears in exactly one historical source. A letter from John Julian, the Whyda's pilot, written 3 weeks before the wreck, to an unnamed recipient in Boston. Julian survived the sinking but died in custody before trial, under circumstances colonial authorities described as suicide, but modern forensic analysis of the inquest report suggests murder. The letter mentions new designs that will change everything and secrets learned from the people of the deep waters. What did Julian mean by people of the deep waters? The phrase appears nowhere else in 18th century maritime writing. The wreck site itself provides no clarity. Discovered in 1984, the Whydah yielded thousands of artifacts, coins, weapons, personal effects, even the ship's bell confirming her identity. But no technical drawings, no plans, no documents describing Bellamy's next innovations. The treasure was there, scattered across the seabed. The human remains were there, still wearing their boots and buckles. But the knowledge Bellamy died protecting had vanished more completely than if it had never existed. Archaeological surveys of the wreck site revealed something else unusual. Blast patterns in the seabed consistent with explosive force, but no evidence of gunpowder weapons or munitions that could have caused such damage. Marine geologists suggested lightning strike, but the probability calculations don't support this theory. Something with tremendous energy struck the Whydah from below, not above. And in the wreckage, among the scattered coins and rigging, divers found human bones exhibiting unusual fossilization patterns, accelerated mineral replacement that shouldn't occur in just 260 years of submersion, as if something in the water around the wider changed the normal processes of decay. The empire of wind and wave lasted perhaps 18 months at its peak. Then Samuel Bellamy sailed north to keep an appointment he never explained, with a woman who'd gone mad in a storm that wasn't strong enough to sink his ship. But sink it did, taking with it secrets that might have changed the age of sail forever. The death of Sam Bellamy began the slow strangulation of Caribbean piracy, not through his loss alone, but because it emboldened colonial powers to finally adapt rather than resist. Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau in July 1718 with a brilliant strategy: pardons for any pirate who would teach Royal Navy sailors the new techniques. Within 6 months, 200 former pirates had accepted the King's mercy, and British naval doctrine began its transformation. The hunter had learned from the hunted. New sixth-rate frigates incorporated shallow draft capabilities and improved sail plans directly inspired by Bellamy's designs. The French developed the corvette class specifically to counter modified pirate sloops. Even the Spanish, traditionally conservative in naval innovation, began building light patrol vessels for Caribbean waters. By 1720, colonial navies could match pirate maneuverability while maintaining superior firepower. Yet Bellamy's innovation could not be contained to military purposes. Bermuda racing sloops, the fastest sailing vessels of the 18th century, descended directly from his designs. The Baltimore clippers that would dominate Atlantic trade 50 years later incorporated his keel concepts. American privateers in the Revolution used variations of his sail configuration to outrun British warships. Even modern racing yachts echo his principle of variable draft through centerboards and swing keels. The cultural impact resonated through centuries. The image of the pirate ship, sleek, fast, and impossibly agile, comes not from the lumbering pirate galleons of earlier eras, but from Bellamy's revolutionary sloops. Sea shanties still sung in Caribbean ports encode sailing instructions for his rigging techniques. The Bahamian boat builders of Abaco passed down construction methods that trace directly to 1716 modifications. In the end, one pirate's crazy invention achieved what no navy could. It democratized ocean travel, proved that innovation could overcome institutional power, and demonstrated that sometimes the greatest revolutions come not from those who follow the rules, but from those who dare to imagine that wind and wave might obey different masters. Samuel Bellamy died at 28, but his ghost sails on in every vessel that prizes speed over size, maneuverability over might, and freedom over conformity. But here's what the records don't tell us. Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau with pardons, yes, but also with something else. His personal papers, archived in the British Library, contain repeated references to the document and assurances from the Brotherhood that compliance will be rewarded. What document? What Brotherhood? Rogers was officially appointed by King George as Governor of the Bahamas, but his commission contains unusual clauses granting him authority normally reserved for admiralty courts and diplomatic envoys. Someone gave Rogers power that transcended normal colonial governance. Someone wanted those pirate innovations controlled, documented, and absorbed into official channels with extreme urgency. The 200 pirates who accepted pardons and taught naval techniques represented nearly every major captain from the Golden Age, except for the ones who didn't. Charles Vane refused and continued pirating until his capture in 1720. Edward England rejected the pardon and sailed to Madagascar. Jack Rackham declined and was eventually hanged in Jamaica. What did these men know that made them choose death over cooperation? Vane's final words before execution, recorded by a prison chaplain who later burned his own notes, allegedly included the phrase, "Better the rope than betraying those who sail beneath." Beneath what? The waves? The stars? Or something else entirely? The absorption of Bellamy's designs into official naval architecture happened with suspicious completeness. By 1725, major European navies had incorporated variations of his innovations, but always with modifications that made the vessels less effective than the pirate originals. The retractable keels were simplified into fixed centerboards. The triangular sail configurations were adapted but constrained by traditional rigging. It's as if the innovations were deliberately diluted, made acceptable for institutional use by removing whatever made them truly revolutionary. Naval historians describe this as natural institutional conservatism, but the pattern is too consistent across multiple nations with competing interests. Someone coordinated this dilution, ensuring that Bellamy's full potential would never be realized in legitimate vessels. The Bermuda racing sloops that descended from his designs won every major Caribbean race from 1730 to 1760, then suddenly stopped competing. The last great Bermuda sloop, Pride of Hamilton, vanished in 1761, while sailing from Nassau to Charleston on a clear day with favorable winds. No wreckage was ever found. Her captain's log, recovered when his sea chest washed ashore 3 months later, contained a final entry. "We are being followed by a ship that matches no design I recognize. Her sails catch wind that is not blowing. We are altering course." The handwriting deteriorates into illegibility after this sentence. Baltimore clippers incorporated Bellamy's keel concepts 50 years after his death, but the specific measurements and ratios that made his design so effective were apparently lost. Modern naval architects examining clipper ship plans note that the keel proportions are slightly wrong enough to be functional but not optimal. It's as if the builders were working from corrupted copies of the original specifications, trying to recreate something they'd heard about but never seen. Where did the original measurements go? Benjamin Hornigold's academy would have had precise documentation. The pirates who accepted Rogers's pardon would have known the specifications exactly, yet somehow, across 5 decades, the knowledge degraded like a story told through too many iterations. American privateers in the Revolution used sail configurations inspired by colonial pirate techniques, according to Continental Navy records. But there's a gap in the chain of transmission. The Golden Age pirates were mostly dead by 1730. The Revolution began in 1775. Who preserved and transmitted Bellamy's sailing knowledge across 45 years? Some historians point to smuggling communities along the Atlantic coast, suggesting continuous underground maritime culture. Others note strange consistency in privateer tactics that suggests formal training from a single source. John Paul Jones, the most famous American naval commander, spent 3 years of his early career on voyages he never described, and that appear in no official records. When he returned, he possessed sailing knowledge that astounded British naval officers who later examined his tactics. The sea shanties that encode Bellamy's rigging techniques are sung in Caribbean ports. Yes, but listen carefully to what they're actually saying. The lyrics describe sail positions and rope work, but they also contain verses about the deep voices that taught the first teachers and the price paid in salt and starlight. Folklorists have documented 73 versions of these shanties across the Caribbean. The technical instructions vary by region and date, but those 2 phrases appear in identical form in every single version, even in islands that had no historical contact during the pirate era. How did identical phrases spread across isolated communities? And what do they mean? Bahamian boat builders in Abaco claim their construction methods trace to 1716, passed down through 11 generations. The claim is almost certainly true. The techniques they use match documented pirate modifications precisely. But these builders also perform certain rituals before launching a new vessel, pouring rum into the ocean at specific tide states, speaking names that don't appear in any historical record, waiting for weather conditions that have no practical bearing on launching. When anthropologists asked about these rituals in the 1960s, the builders became evasive, claiming they were simply tradition. One elderly builder, caught on tape before he realized he was being recorded, said, "We do it because they asked us to, before they went away. We promised we'd remember. So we remember." Who asked them? Who went away? The archaeological evidence from the Wydar wreck site includes one artifact that has never been publicly displayed or adequately explained. Among the coins and weapons, divers recovered a metallic object approximately 8 inches long, cylindrical, covered in symbols that match no known written language from the 18th century or any other period. Metallurgical analysis shows an alloy composition that shouldn't have been possible to create before the late 19th century. The object is kept in a secure facility at the wider Pirate Museum, accessible only to credentialed researchers who must sign non-disclosure agreements. The official position is that it represents contamination from a more recent shipwreck, despite being found in sealed context among verified wider artifacts. 3 researchers who studied the object extensively have published findings. The first, a maritime archaeologist, concluded it was probably a surveying instrument of unknown origin. The second, a metallurgist, noted the impossible alloy composition but suggested modern contamination. The third, a linguist specializing in historical writing systems, submitted a paper that was rejected by every major journal. In it, she claimed the symbols matched patterns found in 3 other locations: carved into a cave wall in the Bahamas near where Nassau once stood, etched into ballast stones from a shipwreck off Madagascar dated to 1720, and painted on a warehouse wall in Charleston that was demolished in 1760. The warehouse demolition records include an unusual notation: materials disposed of at sea by direct gubernatorial order. Location of disposal not to be recorded. The official story of Samuel Bellamy is triumphant. A young pirate who revolutionized sailing, achieved legendary status, and died in a storm, but whose innovations changed maritime history forever. The story is true. It's also incomplete. Somewhere in the gaps between documented history and fading memory, there's another story. A story about knowledge that came from unexpected sources, about debts paid to teachers whose names were sworn to secrecy, about innovations that worked too well and had to be controlled, about vessels that moved in ways that shouldn't have been possible and disappeared in circumstances that don't make sense, about promises made to those who sail beneath, who taught the first teachers, who asked to be remembered before they went away. The wind and waves remember, even if we don't. Every time a sailboat tacks closer to the wind than it should. Every time a keel drops deep and a vessel holds steady in impossible seas. Every time someone looks at centuries of accepted wisdom and asks, what if there's another way? Samuel Bellamy's ghost sails on, but he's not sailing alone, and the shadows grow longer still.